It's the Misfits.
Well, I am blessed to share that I have been a Christ follower since July 8th, 1978. In fact, my maternal great-grandfather was a pastor and a bishop in Holiness Church. My grandfather was a Baptist pastor. Both my parents were gospel singers back in the 1950s, and they had a radio show. Now, all that was unknown to me as a kid, as my parents were not serving God at the time. And I realized later on that I had this heritage in my family and sensed prayers going up for me for quite a while. And my parents renewed their faith, in fact, and began going back to church and being faithful to God. Now, my conversion to Christ happened on the day of disappointment, in which I was exhibiting at an art exhibit, a major art exhibit, in which I was sure I was going to win 3 blue ribbons for my 3 pieces of art, only to find out that there were no awards of any kind. And God used that heartbreak to humble me, a very proud and arrogant young man of 21 years old. And so I returned home to my parents' house. I had moved back to the city after transferring to a local college. And so I began to, I entered the house and trying to hide my tears and shame. And my mother looked at me, and she was a very sensitive lady to the Spirit of God. And she said to me, looked at me and said, "You know what you need to do." And so I went back to my bedroom, and I got on my knees and began to pray. Now, my mom had given me gospel tracts, and I would throw tracts in the trash, get them out of the trash, in the trash, out of the trash. I never threw them away completely. And so I read a tract, a gospel tract, explained the gospel, and I got down on my knees and I received Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, July 8th, 1978. And so my life changed. I asked Christ to forgive me and save me, and of course he did. And so all that noise in my head ceased, the peace of God came, and I began to serve the Lord Jesus Christ. So there's a lot more to a testimony, but that's the essence of my conversion day. And I thank God for saving me and using me.
Hey everybody, welcome back.
It's birthday month.
Last week was my birthday. 2 weeks ago was yours.
It seems like so long ago.
I
I'm
know.
sure you probably feel the same.
As of the day we're recording this, I've got 2 birthday parties for kids I have to throw. We're in the swing of it.
You get to throw.
Yeah, get to throw. Yeah, so it's birthday month. Again, if you want to support us for birthday month, go to ministrymisfits.com/birthday, and you'll get the links. Again, new Patreon supporters will receive a Misfits Paul t-shirt. If you send a Cash App donation of $20 or more, we'll send you a Misfits Paul t-shirt. All to thank you for celebrating birthday month with us.
Yeah, and you get some of the cool Patreon exclusive episodes that we have.
Well, if you join Patreon.
Yes,
but Cash
added
App,
bonus.
you don't get the Patreon stuff.
So it's another bonus of going that way. Right?
Exactly. So it's also yesterday, assuming that I got this out on time, was Father's Day.
Yep.
So happy Father's Day.
Mm-hmm.
I also had gotten to go with Buddy Walk and do we've decided to finally name it because we realized it's actually, I guess, now a tradition where every holiday he and I record and ask the question, is it pagan? Even when paganism has nothing to do with it, just because that's what everybody assumes a podcast on a holiday is about. So if you want to, you should go check that out. It was a YouTube podcast exclusive on Buddy Walk's channel. So if you want to check out the Father's Day episode, you can do that by either going to the Buddy Walk with Jesus YouTube channel and checking out there. Or if you go to our website, ministrymisfits.com, and click on the video tab, we have updated the video page finally, because a lot of you have been complaining about how it looked, and I agree with you. It looked horrible, but that was the best I could do at the time with the tools we had. We got new tools now. So if you go to the Misfits website, click on video, you'll be able to select what season you're looking for, all of that. But over on the side, you'll be able to find a button that says, Is It Pagan? And if you click on that, it'll take you to the playlist of all of our Is It Pagan episodes. So if you don't know, Joe and I have done Halloween, we've done Christmas, we've done Easter, and now we've done Father's Day. And we're going to just keep adding them in there because why not?
You skipped Mother's Day, I see.
We didn't skip Mother's Day. We weren't able to record on Mother's Day was the issue. So next year probably we'll finally be able to hit Mother's Day up. So we are today though talking about a different holiday.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about its origins, but not if it's pagan or not, even though that will somewhat come up with the arguments we have against it. So we are talking today about Juneteenth, which, assuming that I got it working correctly, you may be listening to this on Juneteenth.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not going to talk about this on our own because we have a special guest with us this week. We've got Dr. Bryan Hudson here with us. He is in Indianapolis, Indiana. He's an author. He's a writer. He's an artist.
Photographer.
He's a photographer. Yeah. He's a videographer. He's also the pastor of New Covenant Church there in Indianapolis. And he has agreed to come on and help us better explain Juneteenth. Because you may remember last year, Brandon and I did like a three-minute video on what it actually is because everybody was freaking out about what it was. We have more people freaking out this year even than we had last year. And so we want to have Dr. Hudson help us understand exactly what it is that we're talking about, why it matters, what the church's role in all of it actually is, and what all of this means for us both as a country and as a church and as a local church. So, Dr. Hudson, welcome to Ministry Misfits.
Welcome. I am honored to be here. Thank you so much, Andrew and Brandon. Great to be here.
So you have, we had your website up there a minute ago, bryanhudson.com. You've written a book on biblical justice, and you've also been doing some different video type series. You've had experts on talking about both the biblical justice side, but you also last year, I think it was last year, I can't remember the timestamp, maybe it was 2 years ago, we're doing this discussion on Juneteenth, and you guys had brought up some things that normally don't get discussed when actually looking at the history of the topic. So help us understand, help us walk through the basic history summary, because most of us are aware it's dealing with post-Civil War and slavery. But there's some misunderstandings about what even things within Civil War history actually did. So walk us through a little bit of just a history understanding of what we are actually celebrating on Juneteenth.
Okay, will do. Thank you so much. Interestingly, I myself, as an African American, wasn't clear about Juneteenth until only maybe 10 years ago. And that really is a product of lack of education on this topic, in some cases, miseducation. But essentially, Juneteenth, the backstory is that on January 1st of 1863, there was the first watch night service, African Americans, enslaved people praying because Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd of 1862, in which by the end of that year, on January 1st, his executive order to free enslaved people would go into effect. Now, bear in mind, it was a executive order, not a law, executive order with authority. And it was part of a larger strategy Lincoln had to disrupt the Confederates and to help them lose the Civil War. Because when he issued that decree, and quote unquote freed the slaves. It also empowered Black men to join the Union Army, and even Black men in the South, in the slave states, to join the Union Army. And so not only did it have the effect of quote unquote freeing the slaves, it was also a strategy to sway the effort toward the Union Army against the Confederates. And of course, it actually was successful. And the great surge of Black men coming in to fight for their own behalf and for the Union helped to win the Civil War and defeat the rebel Confederates. So now, so then on January 1st, that was the day in which, again, Black people were waiting for that day to come, because they were thinking, okay, we're going to be free on January 1st of 1863. And so that night, now to this day, churches have what's called watch night service. I did not know until 10, 15 years ago what a watch night service was. And it was the night in which they were watching and praying for the clock to turn to midnight, in which they would be considered free. Well, at the stroke of midnight, their prayers were answered. And so that Union soldiers, many of them now, again, were Black soldiers, were going into slave states, going on to slave plantations and saying, these people are free. They are not your property anymore. And so that's the most important aspect of it, where America's concerned and Black folks are concerned, is that something was done to end slavery. And I can't imagine why that's controversial at all. Now, Juneteenth, let's get to that. So the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. It went into effect on January 1st of 1863. Now, of course, you can imagine that not everybody embraced it. The Confederates, of course, they were rebels by nature, right? And so even though Union forces could enforce the Emancipation Decree in southern states, however, the furthest slave state was Texas. And so it took until June 19th of 1865 for the Union Forces Army to reach Galveston, Texas. And of course, they were not telling people, you're free. They weren't, obviously they weren't, they want to keep that free labor. And they were not letting the enslaved people know that you had been decreed free. Well, the Army showed up and they enforced the executive order. And so in that state, 250,000 enslaved people were then declared free, and the Army came to enforce that executive order. And so June 19th, that's where the date came from. And so Black people began calling that day Juneteenth. And it's like a second, well, really, it's their only Independence Day, because enslaved people didn't recognize. They understood July 4th, right? But realizing that, man, they've enslaved us. So how is that Independence Day for us? So therefore, the June 19th became known as Juneteenth. And it's always been a cultural holiday. And it became a national holiday, of course, a couple of years ago. And I'll just say to that point quickly, and this may be the controversial part, is that what we wanted as Black people was not Juneteenth holiday. We wanted the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. That's what we wanted done. But then Congress, all Republicans were lined up against the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but then all Republicans were for the Juneteenth holiday. And so we appreciate, recognition, but it's like throwing us a bone, because the holiday doesn't really do anything. It's substantive. But the Voting Rights Act, which is it restores some rights that have been lost over the years since the 1964 and 65 Voting Rights Act. So the point is, we celebrate Juneteenth. It was more of an internal celebration, a cultural celebration. And I'm glad that it's being recognized as such. But we really want it, and we're still going to go for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So there it is. Juneteenth come out of that. It comes from the date June 19th of 1865, which is when the furthest slave state received the news, and armies came to enforce the decree upon the slaveholders. There it is.
There's a couple things real quick that we want to dive into, and then we'll have you talk first. But a couple of key things that are going to come back up. One is the role of prayer and the church related to all of this. The other one is the role of culture within all of this, and how both of those things actually are going to be tied together. Because this is one of the things that I'm finding, at least, with the controversy. Because that's one of the things that you kept saying. I don't see how this is controversial at all. It's literally, we're just sharing a story here. The controversy is, at least within the church, is tied to both of those two things. They don't see the prayer, they don't see the church, and they don't see the cultural value.
Yeah. The other element I was going to add is, I think what we talked about is people think this is something new.
Right.
And so when it's new,
we don't like new.
We don't like new. And then with all the other cultural changes that are going on in society, it gets swept up or is given a different message. And so people are given different values to things as well. And the other point I wanted to share too is also in 1968, it was also known as Solidarity Day.
Right.
And so that's kind of another history too, of there could be different names associated with Juneteenth. And so that might be new for some within the church or within America, but it might also carry a different name too. But knowing that it was celebrated before, it's not just this new event.
Well, and part of the thing that we heard a little bit more clearly from a lot of people that, again, they weren't even feeding into the controversy. They were just like, why are we doing this nationally? Was that Juneteenth has always been celebrated in Texas. Texas has always celebrated because they considered it their holiday because it happened in Texas. And we, not to offend our Texas friends, but we know how Texas is. They want their own stuff all the time. So, that also led to some of the controversy and some of the, like, why do you have to take what Texas had created type of thing? But, one of the other things that you brought up before we get into some of the more cultural church-related things is that you were talking about the fact that, everybody knows about the Emancipation Proclamation. We actually do talk about that in school, although some schools are still trying to even avoid talking about that now with the way laws are being written. But one of the things that you talked about in the interview you had done was the difference between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, and how the Emancipation Proclamation really didn't do that much, but the 13th Amendment is what actually should be looked at as what had actually ended slavery as a whole.
That's correct, yes. And I was going to come to that, and that's part of our discussion. Yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. But of course, many people didn't recognize it, until it became constitutional. And so that's where the 13th Amendment comes in, where Lincoln and others, they advocated not only to have executive order, but to codify this freedom for formerly enslaved people. And so, 13th Amendment is the actual order that said that slavery shall be illegal in the United States, except as a punishment for crime. That's all the discussion, by the way. Are you aware of that exception clause in the amendment?
Yes and no.
Okay.
And again, this is part of why you wrote your book, is the fact that it's not talked about well.
Well, essentially, it was a compromise of sorts. And so that, when a person's commit crime and go to prison, they're considered, they're citizens, but they don't have full rights. And so that it was thought that, well, let's leave this caveat in. So once they're in prison, they are like slaves again, in the
Mhm.
sense that they do free labor, they're having to pay a debt to society. But now it actually grew into another problem where we had beginning of the rise of mass incarceration.
Mhm.
We understood that prisons then, and even up till today to some degree, with especially these commercial for-profit prisons, they're actually capitalizing on the labor of people in prison. Black men, also white men as well, but back then it was mostly black men, to the point even where getting into the 30s and 40s and Jim Crow laws in the southern states, especially, there were farms and industry that were being run by prisoners. And so that's a whole other discussion about side effect of 13th Amendment, although we are grateful that it was codified. Now, the 14th Amendment was also essential because what that amendment said was that people who are born in the USA are citizens.
Mhm.
Because the argument was, well, these formerly enslaved people, they were born in Africa or born to enslaved people. We don't recognize their citizenship because they aren't born here. Well, that 14th Amendment then codified that people born in USA are automatically U.S. citizens. And that's controversial today because, of course, with immigrants coming in, undocumented people coming in, what they call illegal people coming in, when their children are born here, they're citizens. That's a point of controversy.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's
Those are two
interesting
amendments
also
that were
though,
so essential.
because this is where, again, we get into the politics informing theology type of thing instead of theology informing politics talk. Because normally when you hear within evangelicalism people talk about the 14th Amendment, it's always just surrounding abortion.
Hmm.
That's the 14th Amendment is what they use to talk abortion. Because the idea of being born here, well, is if they're going to be born here, then they should be citizens in the womb also. And so therefore you have no right to kill them. That's the legalese watered down misfit style of what the argument is with the 14th Amendment. But the reality is the 14th Amendment was to say that the slaves that were born here are citizens. They're not just you. And Dr. Hutton, do you think that part of this also plays into even today the arguments related to American chattel slavery, of the fact that people are still not fully aware of how many generations of slave breeding actually happened within, especially the southern U.S., but the entire country as a whole? Because the argument always is, oh, slavery wasn't that bad because, you hear the argument for that it was missiology, that, well, they would not, we brought the slaves over and evangelized them, and then we just had them work for us.
Mm-hmm.
Or there weren't that many slaves because, look, the entire world was doing slavery. But the reality is, yeah, slaves were brought here originally, but then they were bred.
Yes.
For generations and generations of generations.
Right.
But if we don't focus on that when we talk about why the 14th Amendment was necessary, we get to continue to live in ignorance.
Well said, Andrew. And what you've just described really is the fruit of miseducation or lack thereof. Oftentimes purposeful, willful miseducation to continue to propagate erroneous facts about our history as Americans, Black Americans, and even the language we use. For example, you may be aware of this, let me say it to our audience. People were never slaves. They were enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tremendous difference because when we say enslaved people, you put the focus on who put them in that condition. When we say slaves, we're actually saying, well, this is their identity. They were slaves. This is as if they were born to be slaves, which was part of the theology of those who held that view. So when we kind of force ourselves to use the correct language, we help correct the error in the history.
Mm-hmm.
So people were not slaves. Their identity they were people made in the image and likeness of God. Now, we say slaves loosely. I know that. But I find it's really helpful in these discussions to help people understand enslaved people, because that changes, it puts the onus on those who did it to them. To say they were slaves almost acquiesces to the notion that somehow this was their destiny, this was their purpose, this was their God ordained state in life, which we know it was not. Yeah. So that's one point there. But to your point, people always look like people want to just shift the narratives and restate facts. Well, 14th Amendment in context was crafted in order to grant citizenship rights to formerly enslaved people. That's the purpose of it. Now, people come along and say, well, it's for abortion, all that. Okay, I mean, Constitution can have application, beyond its original intent, but always begin with context, the original intent. In fact, part of my studies in my book related to source documentation, because we have a lot of people telling us what history is. We actually have documents. We can go read for ourselves, the documents, the contemporary writings of the day. And really, it's become a problem in the church. I say the church, not the whole church. We say the church. Who are we talking about? Okay. But it's a problem when people let other people tell them what they can plainly read for themselves. Yeah, and that's part of the problem, where we're not really being studious. We're not being diligent. We're not doing our due diligence. We're just letting somebody tell us what we want to hear. Confirmation bias, about that. Yeah. So, but the real history of our country is way more interesting, than the things that we're told. Long answer to a short question.
Yeah, and I was thinking about it too, of like, was there any teaching of Juneteenth growing up in school? And for me, it was only actually in my AP US history class. So it was a very separate class that was actually even taught in, but traditionally it was not something that was even touched upon. So
Yes.
I think from our US history classes, again, it creates this fear of this is something new that's being taught and I don't like it, so I'm just going to ignore it. Or as you said, Dr. Hudson, of I'm going to look at it through the lens that I want to, instead of approaching it from an open approach. Or as you had up on the screen there, Imago Dei, how do we look and say, everybody's made in God's image, and how do I see the image bearer in everybody I see, even through the lens of history?
And this is where even, going into some of the other aspects that we always talk about related to just the way that theology is talked about or taught. This idea of confirmation bias and not even looking at sources is part of why we end up with the Cold War theology stuff we are always talking about, including the stuff related to the way that race and ethnicity is talked about in the U.S. and among U.S. churches. There were so many people that for the longest time have, rather than actually diving into what we mean when we say priesthood of all believers and actually reading the source text and understanding what Imago Dei actually is, and that it's right there on the first page, we'd rather have it explained to us by somebody that sounds like they know what they're talking about, that then either can say, well, this was only related to white men. Or, like we've talked about even with Pastor Andy, and that we're going to talk about with Rachel, the idea of, oh, well, this only applies to men. Or this only applies to the U.S., which I actually have heard one person try to make that claim. And even the other Christian nationalists were shutting him down because they're like, no, that's ridiculous. So, the lack of education on this topic is part of a bigger microcosm of a lack of education within our churches, but not just our churches, because we see this throughout the country as well. Because like you said, it took an AP history class for you to hear about it. It took me being out of college and working with other African-American churches in the inner city for me to hear about it for the first time. Post-college even, I had not even heard that this was a thing. So we're going to start walking through actually re-educating everybody, which is part of why we have you here. But first, I want us to dive into another aspect that we shelved for a minute and go back to this before we break and then look at the education side of it. So part of what we talked about was the idea of culture, the idea of the watch night services, the idea of prayer being a major piece to this. One of the arguments that we have coming out of people that are upset that we keep calling out Christian nationalism as heresy is they point to the historically black denominations and say, look, all they do is politics in their churches. They have even you look at guys like John Lewis, who have spoken at churches all over the country on a Sunday morning from the pulpit for the past 50 years or so. And they'll claim it's the exact same thing as having Donald Trump speak at the Christmas service at First Baptist Dallas. It's not the same thing. No. And part of what we want to spend a little bit of time in, you provide us with the perfect segue to actually show what the difference is here, is why the political idea, quote unquote, within an African-American church is different than the Christian nationalism stuff that we're always calling out. And the watch night services is a perfect place to start with that. So walk us through a little bit again of what the watch night service was, the first watch night service, and then what it looks like today.
Well, the watch night service, again, came out of the enslaved people who had become aware of the Emancipation Proclamation from September of 1862, which would go into effect on January 1st, 1863. And so the formerly enslaved people, or the enslaved people at the time, were actually waiting for the clock, to hit midnight, in which the proclamation, the general order it was called, went into effect. Now, today, the watch night service has nothing to do with that, honestly. We just call it watch night service. It is a time of prayer, fasting, reflection, just thanking God for the new year. And so we don't think about anymore, the real history or the real purpose. Again, we didn't know. We called it watch night service, because everybody else did, until we learned what it actually was. Now, today, many churches don't go into midnight anymore, because midnight is not a good time to be out. Watch night service at 7 p.m.,
Well, I mean, it's the same thing as the sunrise service starting at 11 a.m. on Easter.
Correct.
So,
Yeah. But it's good that we give at least some homage, to the past. But truly, African-American churches, we preach the gospel. We serve the community. We don't spend a lot of time on politics and all that, because we're not vested that way. We're vested in helping people. Now, to the extent that public policy hurts people, we'll certainly go to the State House and make our voices heard. We may have someone come to church, and talk about an issue. We don't campaign in church for candidates. We're focused on issues. We don't have. The old saying is, we don't have permanent politics. We have permanent issues. If a Republican will do the right thing, we may support that person. If Democrat doing the wrong thing, won't support that person. So it's not that it takes two wings to fly, okay? And so we won't be suckered into just one thing or another. Although the GOP has become so aberrant, so sideways, until that we kind of have defaulted to Democratic politics, not because we believe in everything Democrats say, but because they tend to have our best interest more at heart. So then, but to the larger point, yeah, we really in our churches, people should just go to the live stream, see what churches are doing, because false narratives, Andrew and Brandon, are so rampant. I call it the reign of false narratives.
Mhm.
That the narrative, the narrative, okay, there's the story in the narrative. Now, narratives can be correct sometimes, but sometimes people take the whole story and they'll slice off a portion, add their 2 cents to it, create the narrative, and that becomes their truth. When they've gone away from the story and now they're into the narrative. That's a problem we see today.
People that actually have listened to us since the beginning. So even pre-Brandon. No, a couple of words that you just said there are very much the key to a lot of what we are doing. Because the thing that you talked about with the original Watch Night service, of the fact that it was literally we were watching and praying, but it was something that the community was doing as a whole. Now, it's still watching and praying as a community for the whole. The political stuff that gets talked about is done because it's the politics of the community as a whole. It's all about the community. It's not about individual anything.
Correct.
And probably the debate you've been having recently is people ignoring the physical needs or just the the justification of some people's argument is it's all about winning souls, and we don't look at the person as a person and don't look at their physical needs or what they're going through, and so we discount anything.
Bigger picture here, part of the reason that is so prevalent here in the U.S. is because of the slaveholder theology to begin with.
Yes.
Because that was part of the argument to keep people enslaved, was that it's just about their souls, it's not about their physical state.
Mm-hmm.
But part of what we're talking about here with this idea of re-educating and looking back at what history actually shows us, the church and prayer has been central to the community since even prior to Juneteenth.
And I couldn't find it, so Dr. Hudson, maybe you can help me. Do we know how many churches were participating in that watch night, or like potentially how many cities were there, or is that just one location? What did that look like that evening?
I do not know. It's a great question. I don't know. Although the sense is as many enslaved people who are aware of the Emancipation Proclamation, that it was just their practice to be in church, to worship God. And so this became a point of hope for them. So we don't have numbers or data on that, but it's evident any enslaved person, who had the opportunity, and they did, by the way, they had opportunity to worship on Sundays. But they would gather whenever there was hope, and they would pray around that and ask God to help. So no, there's no data. People didn't keep data or care about keeping data as related to enslaved people back in the day.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break here, and then we come back. We're going to walk through more of what we've been talking about this whole time, as far as the work that you've been doing related to education, miseducation, and especially the church as it relates to topics like Juneteenth and other things surrounding it. So we'll be right back after this break.
We'll be right back.
What's up, everybody? Joe here from Buddy Walk with Jesus. Buddy Walk with Jesus is a show designed to delve deep into the intimate reality of God's present kingdom through raw and honest conversations. And I'd like to invite you guys to join us as we continue on our journey through the book of Matthew. Whether you start from the beginning or jump in at the latest episode, we'd love to have you along for the ride as we seek to unpack the heart of God through the personhood of Jesus. You can find Buddy Walk with Jesus anywhere where you can find podcasts, including our newest home over on YouTube Podcasts. You can also head on over to facebook.com/buddywalkwithjesus. Engage with me over there, as well as our community group at the Buddy Walk community. Remember two very important things: that you are prayed for and you are loved deeply. Peace, y'all.
It's my birthday!
That's right, Misfits. Birthday month is back. Help celebrate the Misfits' birthdays all June by joining Patreon or making a one-time birthday month donation. For the month of June, all Patreon supporters and anyone making a one-time donation of $20 or more through Cash App will receive a Misfits Paul t-shirt as a special thank you. For more information or to find the donations link, go to www.ministrymisfits.com/birthday.
Oh, hello there. My friends call me Brother Matthew. You can too. And I have spent most of my adult life learning history, theology, apologetics, really Christian academia. But recently, I've discovered you can amass all of this knowledge, but not understand God or understand what it means to live out what you believe. If that's you, then follow me on this journey at brothermatthew.net, and we'll discover together how to move from knowledge to understanding, how to have the mind of Christ in the heart of Christ.
We're back.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Hopefully if you're listening to this today, it is Juneteenth, so happy Juneteenth.
And hopefully, because we're not sure if I'm going to actually be able to get it done on time.
Yeah.
But hopefully you're listening to this.
We'll give that little disclaimer on there. So today we have...
So everybody knows how good we are with our schedules and our calendars.
Yeah, so far we've gotten dates right. So that we're
except
good
for
there.
Everything we've advertised, except for this, we got this right. We advertised this last week and it happened. So.
I'm going to talk about the historical dates.
Yeah.
But anyways, today we were here with Dr. Hudson, and we went through a little bit more of the history of Juneteenth, what it is from the historical sense, and then kind of following up towards the end of what role has the church played within this, specifically with the watch nights and some of the history in there, and how prayer and just the overall concept is something not new, and it should be celebrated and embraced. And so next we're going to kind of turn the page and continue some of these discussions a little bit further. Yeah. And also discuss a little bit more about Dr. Hudson's work.
Yeah. So we are going to talk now. We're going to transition in, and it's not even really a transition. It's just saying now we're going to get down to why Dr. Hudson is the one to talk about with this. Is his book, Biblical and Social Justice, What Is It? Deals with some of the things we've talked about before, related thing. We've had the biblical justice talk with Joash. We've talked slaveholder theology with Joash. We talked the history and everything, and even the theology behind police brutality with Pastor Bowman. We talked CRT with Antoine. We've had these little talks here and there. But part of what Dr. Hudson's work does is breaks down exactly why we have so much misunderstanding, both biblically and as a culture politically, around the topic of social justice, and actually defining what it is and actually looking at what the history says and why we don't even understand it. So part of what we want to talk about, there's two headings of chapters specifically related to what we started talking about related to Juneteenth that we want to hear more from you on. One of those was the blessings of education and the perils of miseducation. We talked already about how miseducation, has affected everything related to the topic around Juneteenth. Get into a little bit more. Why is it that you think that we are so miseducated as a country, but then especially as we get into talking about as a church, why are we so afraid of being educated on these sort of topics?
Great questions. I would offer two observations. First of all, the one would be that history is not always a pretty picture. And if persons are in their feelings or, concerned about the impression that history might give, then they're more prone to either ignore or reshape the narrative of history. And so we're seeing that in Florida, Ron DeSantis, the anti-woke nonsense, create a whole law. And so that children don't feel bad, if they read or see history that's not favorable. And the other reason is that honestly, people don't generally care about quote unquote Black history, which kind of goes to our cultural lack of awareness and lack of concern about African Americans in general. There's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is, again, these stories and where people, for example, people think of Black people as a problem people, quote unquote. That kind of is the perception sometimes is out there, that we don't, all of our families are all broken up and no men, the men are doing nothing, and so there are a lot of perceptions. And then there's just a general sense of, I don't know what to say about it, so I'll just step back and ignore it. Well, when that goes to curriculum development and educational systems, then those values get transferred into the academic plan. And so, for example, my children attended a white evangelical Christian school from kindergarten to high school. We were the diversity in almost the whole school. My children, our church. At the time, I was pretty gung-ho about Christian schools, and I was, thinking that godly this, godly that. But then things began to happen. Even my lack of understanding, my miseducation, led me to believe that a Christian school is always better than a public school, even though I'm a product of public school. My wife is. But one story to kind of highlight what I'm trying to say here. When my children went, and I had 4 children, went to Christian school. And at 2 of the kids, one or two of them, elementary school, during their Black history activity in the school, now check this out, they wanted some of the children to portray slaves, others to portray slave owners, and build some activity around something about the Underground Railroad with slaves escaping and all this kind of stuff. It was so bizarre. When I found out about it, well, my wife and I went to the school and said, look, this is not the way you teach Black history. Mm-hmm. You don't put children in a role of being, they would switch roles, right? So to get the feeling it was like to be a slave or it was so wrong. We shut it down. We said, look, get a subject matter expert in here, all right, to help you craft a proper Black history curriculum and activities. Now, I say that because they weren't doing it, to harm or offend our history and Black parents. They just didn't know. What's most disturbing is they didn't know they didn't know. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a long way around of answering the question, laying a foundation for this part of the discussion, is that when people assume and do not seek understanding, do not look for subject matter experts, we end up with a lot of things said and done, curriculum written, disseminated among students that are not only unhelpful, but actually harmful. I'll pause there and we'll go further.
Yeah, that's right. Unfortunately, that's been my experience also. I even remember because I went to a Christian school K through 12. Actually, technically, I went to a Christian school K through college. But I remember the same thing you were talking about being done with some of the older elementary grades of like, we're going to walk through the Underground Railroad type of thing. And it was just kind of bizarre because you have a bunch of sixth graders trying to do this, and most of them don't care, for one, because they're sixth graders. And two, it wasn't really anything educational because it was just the exact same thing that we had just read about, just kind of a watered down history of, oh, look, Underground Railroad, slavery's bad, Civil War. And that was basically it. There was no explanation of anything else. It was just say, this is what it is. And we've talked about before. I think this was one of the shows you were sick for. We even talked about the whole thing you just addressed of the whole, we have this mindset that Christian education is always going to be better.
Mm-hmm.
Without ever actually looking at what makes Christian education more qualified than public education to begin with.
Yeah. Or what is it rooted in?
Mm-hmm. Which is the much bigger question that we always are asking.
True. Yeah. Is it Christ-centered?
And this is where, Dr. Hudson, you may be able to give an even better history behind this, but yes. The thing that is not talked about again is that a lot of the small private institutions that are now Christian schools that have been around for a long time were originally created as a reaction to desegregation of the public schools.
Correct. Yes.
White flight produces white communities that want to stay white, and so they create private education that you have to be qualified to enter.
Mm-hmm. Or pay into,
which is another whole big discussion.
Yeah, I was gonna say we could go down that whole rabbit trail too of whatever is being taught can also be dependent upon.
We could be here for a long time if we really wanted to start breaking all those individual pieces up. Or you could just go buy his book and he'll do it for you. So
thank you.
But why? Part of what you started getting into is just this idea of we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, there had to have been somebody who knowingly decided that we're not going to have people know this anymore.
Let me address that. We love our nation. We love our nation so much, we're prepared to tell ourselves lies about our nation, to maintain a certain feeling about the nation. And the blight on America is chattel slavery. Everybody knows that. It's the thing. It's the thing that drove the Civil War. The Confederates to secede, leading to a Civil War. They say, well, with states' rights to do what? What I'm saying? Own people. And then the curriculum, to your point, the Christian schools came out of the idea of resegregating and protecting our way of life and our vision of America, the idealistic, romanticized ideals. And so curriculum was developed. For example, I got in my book, I'm going to cite a couple examples here of excerpts from history textbooks. This is a Becca book. Now, this is an excerpt from some years ago, so I'll give them credit. Hopefully they have updated and erased this. But listen to this. This is a quote in one of the textbooks regarding Black history. A few slave owners were undeniably cruel. Examples of slaves beaten to death were not common. Neither were they unknown. The majority of slaveholders treated their slaves well. That's one excerpt. That excerpt. Although the slaves faced great difficulties, many found faith in Christ and learned to look to God for strength. By 1860, most slave holders provided Christian instruction on their plantations. You get your mind around that.
Mm-hmm.
Face difficulties. Why are they in difficulty? they found faith in Christ. They had faith in Christ. They came from Africa with faith in Christ. Many did.
Mhm.
So now that's just two examples from many I found in curriculum teaching children. And that's an example of how the story gets reshaped into a narrative or a false narrative, and to make it seem like slavery wasn't so bad. Matter of fact, when we operated a Christian school, a Christian preschool for 15 years, and we had a visit from Bob Jones University curriculum salesman. He came in. I said, "Come on in." He began. I said, well, "Let me ask you a question. Let's talk about slavery." Went straight there. He said, "Well, words to the effect of, slavery was a blessing because it brought Black people to America. It brought Africans to America." That I said, well, I thought myself, there's the door. You know what I'm saying? I didn't push him out the door, but he was soon out of my building because I couldn't believe he said that. But I've learned that's a common mindset, that slavery was some kind of a blessing. The rape, the stealing, the murder, even Exodus says it's to kidnap somebody, you're worthy of death for doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that you all know. But there's the miseducation is a major problem, to where people think they know, they don't know. And unfortunately, because of the feelings that kind of it genders, they don't want to know.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before with like the armor of God, and people like to use Christianity as a sword. And even today, as I have conversations with people, they just justify of, all right, well, as long as Christianity is being spread by any means, then we can say it was at least greater good, and that it was
end justifies the mean.
Yeah, and that capitalism is the best form. So what else do you want me to do? That's the best thing, and we settle for this mediocrity, I guess would be one way of calling it.
It's
but
not
also,
even mediocrity; it's apathy.
Yes. Well, and what's good for me too. And again, we don't look at it from the Christocentric lens. We look at it from our
Cold
own
War theology lens.
Yeah, or even just our own lens, which is got our own biases and different things built up, and maybe miseducation in there as well.
And, you were reading out of Abeka, and I grew up on Abeka, going to a Christian school, and then I've taught at two different schools using Abeka curriculum. The one school that I was teaching all of the high school social studies areas, so that was history and health and government and everything else. When I looked through the updated curriculum from when I was actually taking it myself, I ended up gutting a large portion of what was actually in there and replacing it either with, we're going to look at this topic from a Christocentric lens, and we're going to actually read what the Bible says about these sort of events, or going and pulling people like Dr. Jamar Tisby instead. One of the most glaring examples is within the health book. Because they were talking about, and they were trying to go through Romans 12 and talk about the renewing of our mind and things like that. But what they claimed what it was saying was that we can tell the state your mind is in based off of the outward appearance. And so they showed somebody with a thing on their chest saying godly, with white male, slick back hair, suit and tie. And then they showed one that said worldly, and it was a black man in a hoodie with headphones on. And their claim was, no, we were showing the difference in, this guy's ready to go to church and this guy's ready to go hoop. So even with that idea, what is that actually saying? Just in pictures, no words in the text were talking about it. But the pictures were stating that they were saying that if you're white with slick back hair and a suit on, you're godly already. And if you try to wear a hoodie, or if you're a black male or listen to hip hop, then you're already going to hell and there's no hope. Unless you become like the white guy. Mm-hmm. Right. And now we're back into assimilation talks. Yeah. This is more more common than we realize within, especially Christian education. You won't find that sort of blatant thing within public school textbooks, because the public school isn't talking about the renewing of our mind.
Right.
They're not talking about, well, if you go to church, then you're okay. If you don't go to church, you're not. But we do have things like the laws being passed in Texas and in Florida. They're trying to change the narrative all the way around, whether it's public school or private school or homeschool or whatever.
And university level too.
University levels as well. I mean, you just said Bob Jones is a university. They're the ones producing this curriculum. Abeka is put out by Pensacola Christian College.
Right.
These are universities that are doing this. You know, we talked about this with Joash, and I know, Dr. I saw you. I think I was in the conversation with you. If not, I was just watching and cheering you from afar. Of the fact, you know, people don't realize that within the Southern Baptist Convention, on their seminaries, the buildings still hold the names of slaveholders.
Yes.
Boyce Bible College, who I've got a lot of good friends that have attended and have enjoyed, they don't even realize that the guy it's named after was a slaveholder.
Mm-hmm.
And was not just a slaveholder, but was an apologist for slaveholding as a theology.
Yes.
We have a lot of these different things that we don't even recognize because we've become so accustomed to it. And that's really where, you know, going into the other chapter that we wanted you to kind of walk us through, the first thing you talk about is perceptions, PTSD, incarceration, and reentry.
Yes.
Walk us through a little bit, because, you know, most people would understand what perceptions is. Most people understand what incarceration is, but the PTSD and reentry alone is enough for people to shake their heads like, what's going on? But especially when you combine it with the other two, what are we dealing with here?
Well, this chapter was my attempt to explore what we perceive as bad behaviors of people, especially Black men in particular. Of course, we know about the incarceration rate. There are 2.2 million people in our nation's jails and prisons. I'm reading here, 500% increase over the last 40 years, more than any other nation. And so we know a large percentage of those in prison are Black men. Not the largest percentage is white men, but in terms of per capita. Mm-hmm. And so I began to think now. Also, I'm involved in prison ministry. I work directly with a ministry that receives men out of prisons who confess Christ, and they go to an aftercare facility. He disciples them. It's called Jesus House. Passed away in Bumpus, and they, the national rate of recidivism is like 70% thereabout. He has a 90% success rate. But what is it that leads to the sense of agitation? I find myself sometimes agitated when I'm pulled over by the police. It's happened to me several times, and I realize I haven't had trauma, but even those instances of being pulled over for no reason infuriate me, anger me, and it's not post-traumatic stress disorder I'm experiencing, but it's something leading to that. Now, only imagine if you got a Black child, a boy, who's misidentified, grabbed, handcuffed, threw in the back of a police car, and find out he didn't do it. You release him. Well, as African-American males, we all have experienced this to a greater or lesser degree. And my thinking was, now this has not been fully studied, but my thinking was, what's the effect of that? The effect in a cumulative way, generationally, when people are mishandled or abused, what effects does it have generationally? And there are effects. Now, again, there's been some studies. My book cites a few studies, but again, what people don't care about, they don't study. Okay, So we have to go on lived experience, and I think that anecdotal data, while it's not, you can't measure it, we can't dismiss it either. When people tell you stories, I think it's good to believe them, or at least listen to them. So that chapter came came out of that concern I had. I began to research post-traumatic stress disorder, and I noted that it's a mental health condition triggered by a terrifying event. That's interesting. Now, of course, we know what happens with people go through hurricanes and car accidents and crime. We know those factors. But I would suggest even police mishandling, police brutality, even witnessing George Floyd's murder was traumatic for all of us, Black and white people. Well, I must say there were some white folk that didn't really care. I thought he deserved it. He was a criminal, all that kind of stuff. That's heartbreaking too. But these experiences, I've watched that video maybe twice. I don't want to see it anymore. I've seen enough of that. And so to this day, in fact, a month after he was murdered, I was pulled over on the highway by the police, by a state trooper. And the guy looked like the guy who, in my mind, he looked like the guy who killed George Floyd. It triggered me, okay? And so it is interesting to consider that there, while we can never claim anything for a whole group of people, all Black folk, all white folk, we can't do that. That's just irresponsible. But there have to be some effect that accumulates when Black men experience treatment, mistreatment, or just plain ignored, disrespected. So again, I can't diagnose. I'm not a doctor. I won't say it's PTSD, but I wonder, as a preacher, as a man of God, as a father, community leader, shouldn't we pay attention, or even consider that the behavior we're looking at, we don't always understand what we see. Think that child, he's acting out. What's wrong with that child? He shouldn't act this way. Well, you don't know his history. You don't know what he's been through. And so we should become more compassionate, more Christ-like in compassion. We don't excuse bad behavior. We don't give people a pass for doing something wrong. But let's try to understand. I learned a long time ago, a mentor taught me this, that there are more broken hearts than hard hearts. That's a conviction I have. There are more broken hearts than hard hearts. And so we think it's a hard heart. He's hard. Maybe it's a broken heart. And so in the child, they have less emotional control. But honestly, sometimes cops have less emotional control than children, if you think about it. So let's try to understand. Even police officers. I had an in-law who was the first Black police chief of my city. So I have great respect for law enforcement. I really do. I've got cop friends, who are photographers and things. But in our view, it is such people in authority, preachers, police officers. There is no tolerance level. We can't say, well, we'll permit 10% cops to be dirty, 10% preachers to be ungodly. We don't think that way. But back to the point, and I'll just conclude here, let you ask questions, make comment. I think we should consider what are the effects of mistreatment, outright abuse, systemically on Black folk, Black men in particular. And we can't dismiss it totally.
Yeah, and I know there's studies out there too that have shown that trauma can actually travel through DNA, which is incredible. And specifically, the data was shown from the Holocaust and how the grandparents and now the grandchildren that were the grandparents that were in the Holocaust, there's still triggers, as you mentioned, from their grandchildren today that are still seeing that they didn't experience that from almost 100 years ago now, but they're still seeing those triggers that was passed through the DNA. And so I think that as we look at that from the slaveholder side, I don't think we fully comprehended or taken the time to see the true effects and just ripple effects that's creating for people and within our nation.
That's part of what we're going to talk about with Joel Bowman again when he comes back, is this whole mental health side of it.
Good.
But
He's
even
qualified.
from just a basic idea of, because again, this is one of the things we hear all the time, of the idea of, well, it happened so long ago, it doesn't affect me, so why should I have to care about it? It was a slip of the tongue with you just now, but I think you actually made a good point, because you said the same thing we think of when we talk about slave holding, as far as the trauma being brought down.
Yes.
You meant enslavement.
Yes, thank you.
But
Also,
what you actually said is part of what the issue is that the same mindset that triggered the idea of slave holding can be passed on through generations, the same way that a traumatic experience that a family is remembering will be passed on.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always, and this is something we see, even if we want to get into where does it say that this is possible in the Bible? That's part of why the Passover existed as a celebration, was God telling the people, you must remember why or how you escaped. Remember your toils in Egypt. He says it all throughout with the prophets. Remember how it was in Egypt, even though now we're 1,000 years out. Don't you remember what you went through in Egypt and how I brought you out? Cultural and generationally, the trauma is going to continue to pass on until it is actually repented of. We believe that the sins of the father does not affect the child. But when we're talking about cultural systemic issues like this, it's not just the sin of the father. It is also my sin as well, because I am a part of this community.
Mm-hmm.
Which again goes back to what we were talking about, the misunderstandings related to even how, the African American church is looked at compared to the white church, is one that, unfortunately, as we're discovering with all of the debates that keep happening against us, this is part of the argument we've been having, or I've been having, and I think you've been watching, Dr. Hudson, probably, I don't know if I want to get myself involved with this guy or not, of the arguments surrounding even the idea of love your neighbor. It's always, well, we only are called to love other Christians. We're not called to love non-believers. And it's because of the fact they've separated themselves out from the community to begin with. The white evangelical church as a culture is not a community-based church. They've gone fully Roman-style evangelism. You don't have that within African-American churches, African-American communities, or even just non-white churches and non-white communities. We go to a intentionally multi-ethnic church. It is all about the community. There is no question. If you walk into that gym and think, oh, all they care about is themselves, you only just walked in and left before actually listening to anything.
You didn't stop in the restroom.
Yeah, or go into the restroom at all. Yeah. Because you can see the community through, if you just look up while you're in the stall. The whole idea behind the community doesn't necessarily fit within white evangelicalism. And part of that is, unfortunately, because of the fact that there is no such thing as a white community. Because white encompasses all of Europe. As opposed to when we talk about things like the Asian American church, which they are able to unite over a actual common tongue. The African American church that is able to unite over shared trauma and a shared sense of identity and community found in freedom through Christ. You don't have that within a white culture. You can't. It's not possible, because white culture does not actually exist, which is part of the arguments that we keep having with the Christian nationalists also. It can't happen. But when the focus is on the community, by default, you're going to have a Christocentric mindset to be able to keep theology going while also serving the community, because the only person we've ever seen do that effectively was Christ.
Yes.
And his apostles, who were doing it because they had Christ's Spirit within them. That's the only option we've got. One other thing that you had mentioned, Dr. Hudson, while we were talking, and that I thought might be somewhat connected, and I had never thought. So I want to ask you before we close out, because I'm not going to remember to ask you again. When you were talking about the idea of, the way that we talk about the Civil War as states' rights instead of as a war over slavery, when we also then look at how we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation compared to even the 13th Amendment or even the Civil Rights Movement, do you think there's a little bit of a connection there? Because we'll talk about the Civil War being a war for states' rights, but then celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation, which actually was a violation of states' rights in every sense. We don't, though, want to talk about the idea of slavery or anything like that affecting the 13th and 14th Amendment, which was actually back to states' rights, because now we're codifying into law that's been ratified by the states. But we don't want to talk about that because now we're back, same thing with the Civil Rights Movement. Everybody now wants to honor Dr. King as somebody that was colorblind. They don't want to talk about what led to him having to make the I Have a Dream speech. We don't want to talk about the fact that the I Have a Dream speech was not colorblindness. Do you think that some of the way that, again, we're going back into the miseducation side of this, that some of the miseducation that may not have even been intentional is still fully related into the fact that we don't have Imago Dei actually at the center? And so we have to justify still separating out race even when we're teaching? Or is it much more of just, this is just how by default we end up talking about these things? We want to honor Lincoln because he was shot. We want to honor Martin Luther King because he was shot. Mm-hmm. We don't want to look at the bad stuff. We just want to honor the heroes? Or is there much more of a, we want to teach it this way type of mindset?
Great question. Honestly, I cannot fundamentally speak to people's motivations and mindsets. I can look at the fruit that we see, and it certainly seems apparent to me that people do not respect other people fully as Imago Dei, made in God's image, because we wouldn't treat people a certain way if we saw people as we see ourselves. And of course, we know that going back to the slavery days, no person of a good conscience would enslave someone they thought was their equal, right? So obviously Africans were considered to be subhuman. We know about all that. Even to this day, it makes me wonder, just as, PTSD has affected me in some way. I mean, not PSD, but trauma, I'll say, has affected me, though I'm free from enslavement and all that. I wonder if maybe others are also equally affected by generations of miseducation and thinking that people are a certain way, and they're more willing to disrespect people, not honor people, or view, for example, race, Black race, as a certain kind of people. I wonder about that. I cannot say definitively, but from the fruit and the behavior that what I've received and have observed, it seems evident that there's a deep misunderstanding, whether willful or ignorant, of the appreciation of every human being. For example, I don't even use the word race anymore. I'm of the mindset there's only one race, not a cliche, but truly I believe one race, the human race, and many ethnicities and nationalities, right? So my nationality is American. My ethnicity is, I'm not sure fully. Ancestry DNA said I'm mostly Nigerian, and I got some Welsh up in there somewhere too, but I know I got Irish. I told my friends, funny story, before I got my test, I told folk I'm 100% Black man. I knew it wasn't true. And the test came back, I was only 80%, okay? My point though is, if when people even emphasize race, black race, Asian race, then we get to who's the best then? If you're going to start bringing up races, then the discussion, the logic leads, well, who's on top, who's on bottom? And so that's a problem. So I think God's view is better here, where there are no races, Ham, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all that, we make that a racial thing. It's not a racial thing. It's a people thing. It's an ethnicity thing. It's a nationality thing. So I kind of diverted somewhat from your question, but
no, you didn't. You did answer the question though.
Okay.
Because the question really, where are we at the heart of all of this? Is it something where we've just kind of fallen? We are all victims of somebody else's problem that they had, which we talk about a lot. Related to even some of the bad theology that is being taught within our seminaries and within our churches. The people that are teaching it are victims of it themselves. They are not the ones that created it; they're victims of it. It's the same sort of thing we've got going on here in a lot of ways, but the bigger piece of all of it falls back at do we actually believe God when he says that all mankind is created in his image or not?
Mm-hmm. There it is.
That's where most of this lies. It's the same thing, going back again to the arguments we've been having over community and over who we are to care for. It's much easier to say, I don't have to care for you if you are not made in the image of the God that I'm claiming to be serving. If you're made in the image of the God I claim to be serving, why would I not want to serve you? Because in serving you, I am serving him, which is literally what Jesus tells us we are doing when we do this.
Yes.
It's nothing new.
Yeah. Even the least of these you did for me.
Right. The least of the, and again, what do people want to do with that verse? They want to qualify it. Well, it's not the least of everybody. It's the least of our brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we're looking at things as some people are made in the image of God and some aren't, then yeah, not everybody is our brother. But if everybody is made in the image of God, then me serving you is not a violation of serving my brother.
Yeah.
When we look at history as a whole in the way we teach it, the idea of, well, we don't want to make this person feel bad so we don't teach it this way. It's the same idea of not serving our brother, because we're saying that this person not feeling bad, we need to protect, but this person over here not feeling bad, we don't need to protect.
Correct. There it is.
Why is it that it's more important for a white person not to feel guilty than for a person of color to not understand the history behind why this school thinks that the white people are going to feel guilty? We're excluding it again.
Mm-hmm.
It's not this. It's not we're protecting everybody. It's we're protecting one area of society and again excluding all of the rest.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's the only way we can look at it. And when we do this within our churches, whether it's related to things like you were talking about with the PTSD thing as far as abuse and mental health, or whether we're talking about racial reconciliation, we're talking about multi-ethnic ministry, all these different things, when we talk about the idea of, well, we can't talk about that because it's Marxist, or because it is not the gospel, or because we are, again, excluding members of the community from actually hearing what God has for them because he created them in the image of God.
Yes. Let me share also on that point. It's a challenge for churches. I'll say the church, let me be specific, evangelical, the white church more. And it's almost to the point, brothers, where, when discussions come up, justice, social justice, racial reconciliation, things like this, when I see a preacher pop up, and want to do something, I'm like, well, okay, I'm not going. You won't see me, because we've been living this for decades, working on it for decades. You pop up and want to deal with it in a meeting on next week. And that's not how we address any issue in life that's important. And so honestly, I kind of roll my eyes now when church folk, preachers talk about doing stuff. It's like, go ahead, and a lot of us Black preachers who are really engaged, we just decided, you know what? Let's not waste our time over there. Let's find brothers like Andrew and Brandon who are consistently working on issues, consistently speaking about it. Not only this topic, but you see them. I see you, for example, come back to these topics. You preach other things, do other things, but you come back to this over and over again. That's highly impressive. And so we have, I say we, I mean, a lot of us Black preachers of a certain age and even younger, we really want to gravitate to people who are taking all this seriously. And we want to get away from people who want to photo op, have a discussion. I am sick of discussions. we're going to discuss it. Well, Dr. King, they would discuss what to do and have plans of action. And so I'm not going to meetings where we talk about stuff if the talk isn't about what are the steps we'll take after the meeting. So anyway, thank you, brothers. I want to commend you all for the work you're doing. But the church, I don't know what to say. Dr. King and that whole movement, they were the church, people of God, but they weren't working through churches per se, because the church, even Dr. King knew the church is for preaching the gospel. It's for discipling people. It's for serving. We can work, we are the church. We're going to work in the community and use resources in the community. We're going to, press levers, even political levers if need be, to get policy change to benefit people. So the idea of the church doing social justice, is not really our mission, but we as believers, citizens, it is our mission. That's one thing I think I've learned a lot, in my research, is that the church is not one thing, but then the believers who are citizens have roles and purposes and responsibilities that include worship on Sunday, Bible study, Sunday school, and all that. We don't turn the church into a social justice institution, but we as the citizens who are believers and Christ followers, we go out and we mix it up in society, we engage, we make a difference wherever we can.
Yeah, you said some really good points in there. Specifically, I think we see that in our community too, where there's a handful of Black Christians that they're just sick of having the conversation of, we're just going to have a discussion and talk about it today. And that's where it's going to lie, which for some, that is where they need to start, because they've never had that education session.
If it's related to the education, miseducation, rather than just saying we've had the talk.
Yes. But like you said, a lot of people are getting sick of, okay, we've been dealing with this for years. Like, what are we, the body of Christ, actually going to step out and do something? When are we actually going to be the hands and feet of Jesus? And I think people are just sick of, okay, here's the action plan, and that's all we ever sit at. And there's never any action that we take forth. But again, ultimately, it does start with the education side and the conversations, but then we need to immediately then move to action and go forth that way.
And one immediate action that can be taken would be to educate ourselves on the topic, which you can do so by going and finding Dr. Hudson's book, Biblical and Social Justice, What Is It? You can get that. It's biblicaljusticebook.com. You can find it there. You can also, you'll be able to find it in his guest portal once we get that up on the website. So if you go to ministrymisfits.com, click on guests, click on his name, you'll be able to find that. Or if you go to the book section in our resources, you'll be able to find it there. It's available with Kindle. It's available on Amazon, all these different things. But you can also find it there at that website. If you want more from Dr. Hudson, you can find out about his blog. It's bryanhudson.com.
Bryan.
Yes, Bryan.
The correct spelling, as we joked about.
Yes, as he made very clear, the only appropriate spelling of the word. Bryanhudson.com. You can also find out about his church there in Indianapolis, get some of the live streams, listen to some of his sermons, listen to some of the other different things that he's doing there. It's newcovenant.org. Again, he's a pastor there in the Indianapolis area. Sorry, I was thinking of another person I was just talking to. In the Indianapolis area, there it's newcovenant.org. You can find out all of that. Again, his book is biblicaljusticebook.com. And then, Dr. Hudson, you talked about it with us a little bit. You talked about it in your thing as far as your artistry, your different forms of media and photography. Just share a little bit about what people can find at visionmediaexperts.com.
Yes, I have had really a kind of a bivocation for my whole career. And I was formally trained in art school, design school, media arts and science. I have a degree in that. And so the Lord let me continue to use those skills and skill sets in my ministry, and also to serve other, mainly nonprofits. I do a lot of work for the nonprofits, video production and web development with a small team of people. That's at visionmediaexperts.com is my nonprofit media company.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the pictures now and they're beautiful. I'm like, man, I want to put these up in my house.
So yeah, if you want to see what Brandon's looking at right now, visionmediaexperts.com, you can check out all of that. I'm hoping, assuming that he still is willing to do it with us now, that he's actually done it with us once. Hopefully we'll be able to have you back on, Dr. Hudson, especially, we could definitely, we already said we could fill a couple of different episodes talking education, even then going further than that, talking the incarceration stuff as well, and the way that it's done here in the U.S. and the way the church talks about it. In the meantime, though, Misfits, it is birthday month.
Yes.
So again, ministrymisfits.com/birthday. You can get the links, join Patreon. Cash App donations, $20 or more gets you a Misfits Paul t-shirt. If you don't want to celebrate our birthdays for whatever reason, you don't want to celebrate our birthdays, but you still want to get some Misfits Paul gear, you can do that on the merch store.
I thought you were going to say wait till next year, celebrate again.
Or wait till next year when we celebrate again. But if they don't like celebrating our birthday this year,
maybe they'll have a change of heart.
There's fully that if somebody's going to have a change of heart on us over the next year, it's not going to probably be in the positive. So if you want Misfit Paul gear, though, go to the merch store. You can also get some of the Tikva gear. The Tikva gear, the money that we get from that goes back to the money going to Tikva to help with the work they're doing with our inner city kids. We're hoping to be able to actually go have some fun with them here in a few weeks once they get their summer stuff going, do some kickball, things like that with them. Also, a reminder, Father's Day was yesterday, assuming that you're listening to this one. I did it. Father's Day was yesterday. If you want to go listen to the Father's Day special that we did with Buddy Walk, you can find that in the video section on our website. Little bit of a warning. The second half of the video gets very heavy, very emotional. And so if Father's Day is a rough day for you, we fully understand, and you probably want to just avoid the topic altogether by not watching the video, because that's part of what we're talking about in the discussion. So, Dr. Hudson, again, thank you for doing this, even though we did hit you up very, very short notice. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for talking with us. Again, if you want to find his book, it's biblicaljusticebook.com. If you want to see the other works he's been doing, it's bryanhudson.com. If you want to see everything, go to ministrymisfits.com, go to the guest section. We don't know what's going on next week, and we've given up trying to
plan because
ahead of time. But we're hoping to be able to, here in the next few weeks, talk to Joel Bowman again related to the mental health stuff we discussed today, as well as we are eventually going to get Rachel Hunka in studio and have the discussion on women in the church as well. So we will see all of you next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.